Everybody.
Good evening, everybody.
Hi. So I have a big mouth anyway, so this just doesn't work. So my name is Tamika Herbert, and I am the Secretary of Sisters Network of the Oregon and Southwest Washington chapter. We began here in this area of January of 2014, and also in our midst is our treasurer, Connie Carley. And our president, Kimberly Moreland, is around here running around somewhere. So thank you so much for coming to this session. So I'm going to do a little introduction on Dr. Newman. I know some people are still eating, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So if you have questions, we have time for those, okay? Dr. Newman is a surgical oncologist and director of the breast oncology program for the multi-hospital Henry Ford Health System in metropolitan Detroit, Michigan. She serves as the founding medical director for the newly created HFHS International Study for the Study of Breast Cancer Subtypes. Dr. Newman is a Susan G. Komen Scholar for the 2016-2019 term. She maintains a very active community service record, and she also serves as Sisters Network Chief National Medical Advisor. Dr. Newman holds a master's degree in public health from Harvard University and her undergraduate education at Harvard University with a major in chemistry. She attended medical school and completed her general surgery residency training at the State University of New York Health Science Center at Brooklyn. Dr. Newman's primary research has focused on ethnicity-related variation in breast cancer risk and outcome, the evaluation and management of high-risk patients, broadened applications for neoadjuvant chemotherapy and special surgical techniques. Her disparities research has been published in numerous peer-reviewed medical journals and also featured in CNN's documentary Black in America Too. That's just a little bit of what Dr. Newman has done. So, Sisters Network, we went to the conference in Detroit in October. The information she presented was absolutely mind-blowing. So, without further ado, Dr. Newman.
I am so appreciative of Damika and everybody here in Portland. It's been a beautiful, a very, very warm welcome to lovely Portland, Oregon. It's wonderful to join you guys today. And it's indeed an honor for me to be able to talk to you about some of the work that I've had the privilege of being involved with, looking at African ancestry and it's associated with the biologically more aggressive pattern of breast cancer that we commonly call triple-negative breast cancer. I have no disclosures to make. Now, whenever we embark on any discussion of health outcome disparities related to racial ethnic identity, inevitably we end up talking about socioeconomic disparities and the inequities in distribution of wealth in our country. So this is appropriate because as we see from these bar graphs, which are actually taken from about 20 years ago, proportions of the population that belong to the racial ethnic minorities, such as African Americans and white Americans, proportions of those minority populations that live under the poverty line or that lack health insurance are about 2 to 3 times higher than the impoverished and underinsured populations in the white American community. Now, we've made some improvements over the following couple of decades, but these disparities persist. And so as recently as the 2013 U.S. Census data report, we still see that poverty rates are more than twice as high in African Americans compared to white Americans. And while we've made some improvements in the last few years in terms of health care coverage for the broader population of Americans, there are still lags in terms of the larger proportions of African Americans that are underinsured or that lack health care insurance completely compared to white Americans. So it's pretty easy to imagine that these types of socioeconomic disadvantages will have a negative impact on breast cancer impact, mediated through their effects on delaying breast cancer diagnoses, delaying treatment, so that African American women tend to be diagnosed with more advanced stage distribution of breast cancer compared to white American breast cancer patients. And ultimately, most tragically, we have higher mortality rates from breast cancer compared to white American women. We've known, however, for many years now that these socioeconomic disadvantages are not the only factors that account for the differences in breast cancer outcome that are observed between African American and white American breast cancer patients. And just one example of the type of statistical information that proves this fact to us is taken from a meta-analysis that I had the pleasure of conducting with some of my colleagues from the Harvard School of Public Health back in 2006. And what we did in this study was simply to combine all of the studies that had appeared in the published literature looking at survival from breast cancer in African American compared to white American breast cancer patients, but focusing on those studies that accounted and controlled for socioeconomic status in some fashion. So this gave us a very robust patient population whose survival rates we could analyze, more than 13,000 African American breast cancer patients whose survival was compared to more than 75,000 white American breast cancer patients. And after pooling all of these data together, you can see down at the bottom that African American identity continued to be associated with a statistically significant mortality hazard, a nearly 30% higher death rate from breast cancer. Furthermore, if we look at the other characteristics that describe the breast cancer burden of the African American community, we see that many of these characteristics cannot be easily ascribed to socioeconomic status. For example, until very recently, lifetime incidence rates of breast cancer were actually lower for African American women compared to white American women. And yet we have this younger age distribution. And for women younger than the age of 45, breast cancer incidence rates are actually higher for African Americans compared to white Americans. And then, as we will talk about throughout the remainder of this lecture, African American women have a higher frequency of adverse tumor features, a higher frequency of the high-grade aneuploid tumors, the hormone receptor negative tumors, and the triple negative breast cancers. There is also a very poorly understood higher incidence rate of male breast cancer in the African American community. And again, all of these latter features you really would not expect to be explained by socioeconomic status, and so it is therefore incumbent upon us to look at other features related to tumor biology and the genetics of breast cancer that might be accounting for these differences in the breast cancer burden of African Americans compared to white Americans. Now, you could reasonably surmise that looking at clinical trials data would be the perfect way to disentangle racial ethnic identity from socioeconomic status in trying to figure out what the predominant factor is in driving the higher mortality rates from breast cancer in African Americans. And this is where a study that I've summarized on this slide, I believe, is very telling. And this was a landmark study that was published back in 2009 in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute by Kathy Albane and colleagues looking at data from the Southwest Oncology Group clinical trials. So what these investigators sought to evaluate was the question of whether by participating in a clinical trial, which should have all of a patient's stage of disease, treatment, and monitoring very tightly regulated through the clinical trials mechanism, they wanted to see if these patients, regardless of racial ethnic identity, would have the same outcomes. And so they looked at the Southwest Oncology Group adjuvant trials for a whole host of cancers, not just breast cancer. They looked at breast cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, and some GYN malignancies as well. And it was very gratifying to see that for the most part, equal treatments delivered in the context of participating in a clinical trial did actually result in equal outcomes regardless of racial ethnic identity. However, this was not the case for the gender-specific cancers, the hormonally driven cancers. For breast cancer and prostate cancer, the African American clinical trials participants still had a statistically significant survival disadvantage and higher death rates. The table at the bottom is simply summarizing the results from this study, looking at breast cancer outcomes in premenopausal and postmenopausal SWOG clinical trial participants, showing that the African American participants had higher rates of recurrence from their cancer and higher mortality rates from their breast cancer. Now, I thought again that this was a landmark study, and most investigators interested in disparities research agreed. However, we were very dismayed by this review of Kathy Albane's study that appeared in Time.com. And we were dismayed not because of the attention that the study generated. I think that the publicity was very appropriate. This was a truly pioneering publication. But the Time.com authors entitled their review, "Why Racial Profiling Persists in Medical Research." And racial profiling, of course, has a lot of very appropriate negative connotations, but when it comes to cancer research, we have an obligation to look at all of the characteristics of our patients that might be accounting for differences in cancer outcome and differences in response to treatment. And in cancer research, racial profiling is really just another name for epidemiology. Now, the importance of racial profiling, if you will, in looking at breast cancer outcomes is pretty clear when we look at the most basic of epidemiologic statistics regarding breast cancer burden. Those data being breast cancer population-based incidence rates and breast cancer population-based mortality rates. The incidence rates are shown here at the top, where we see, as I alluded to previously, the population-based incidence rates for breast cancer in African American women have historically been lower than those rates for white American women, and changes in those rates when they occurred typically occurred in parallel. We see a different pattern for the mortality rates, as shown by the bottom two curves. Breast cancer mortality rates were actually equivalent for African American and white American women until we got to the early 1980s. And in the early 1980s, those mortality rate curves separated predominantly because of the fact that the mortality rates were declining in white American women, but staying mostly the same in African American women. So I think that this is largely explained by the fact that by the early 1980s, we started seeing unmasking of the tumor biologic differences in breast cancer between white American and African American women because of the introduction of adjuvant endocrine therapy. Tamoxifen became approved as therapy for breast cancer in 1977, and so by the early 1980s, we start to see declines in breast cancer mortality rates because of utilization of this wonderful early form of targeted therapy for breast cancer. African American women, however, as has been demonstrated by several different investigators, we have a notably higher rate of estrogen receptor negative breast cancers, and so we are simply not benefiting from tamoxifen therapy, from adjuvant endocrine therapy, to the same degree as white American women with breast cancer are benefiting because of the fact that we are more likely to have tumors that are hormone receptor negative. Lisa Carey and colleagues went one step further in looking not only at hormone receptor expression in black versus white American breast cancer patients, but also by looking at immunohistochemistry to identify the basal breast cancer surrogate, the basal breast cancer subtype. And the basal subtype of breast cancer, as defined by gene expression studies, is a truly inherently biologically aggressive pattern of breast cancer. In clinical practice, we use the triple-negative breast cancers as a surrogate for identifying the basal subtypes because about 80% of the cancers that are negative for the estrogen receptor, the progesterone receptor, and the HER2/neu marker belong to that aggressive basal breast cancer subtype. So Lisa Carey looked at the ER/PR and HER2 markers, in addition to looking at some other markers by immunohistochemistry, and found that African American women, especially premenopausal African American women, had at least 2 times higher rates of these basal subtypes and triple-negative breast cancers compared to women with other racial ethnic identities. Their findings have now been replicated by many other investigators, both in single institution studies as well as on a population basis. All of those studies demonstrating that within each study, you see about twice as many triple-negative breast cancers in the African American patients compared to the white American patients. The study at the bottom, I think, is very interesting. This is a study that comes from the California Cancer Registry, looking specifically at frequency of triple-negative breast cancer in men with breast cancer, again demonstrating higher rates of triple-negative tumors for the African American male breast cancers compared to the white American male breast cancers. So I'm sure all of you in the audience are already aware of the clinical relevance of having a triple-negative breast cancer. As I mentioned previously, the triple-negative breast cancers, the cancers that are negative for the estrogen receptor, the progesterone receptor, and the HER2 new marker, these are cancers that tend to be inherently more aggressive. They are more likely to metastasize. They are more resistant to treatment. And they are not only biologically more aggressive, but it's more difficult to address them with lower toxicity because of the fact that we don't have targeted therapy for them. The bulk of our targeted therapies for breast cancer focus on those 3 markers, ER/PR and HER2 new, with endocrine therapy, hormonally active cancer treatments such as tamoxifen, the aromatase inhibitors. Those treatments all focus on hormone receptor positive disease, anti-HER2 therapy with Herceptin, Perjeta. These agents focus on the HER2 new overexpressing cancers. So the women with triple-negative disease are more likely to need systemic therapy because of the fact that their cancers are more challenging, but they have fewer medical systemic therapy options that we can provide for those cancers. It's also interesting to note that the triple-negative breast cancers in and of themselves, regardless of family history, are significant red flags of a patient that might harbor a BRCA1 mutation. So when we talk about the higher risk of triple-negative breast cancer in African American compared to white American women, we have to then at least comment on the issue of screening mammography guidelines. And I'm sure, again, everybody in this audience is aware of the hotly debated controversy regarding the age at which women in America should initiate screening mammograms. For several decades, we had said that all women in the United States should start getting their mammograms at age 40, and they should continue them yearly thereafter. Well, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force issued an updated guideline in 2009 where they recommended that American women delay initiation of screening mammogram until they reach age 50. And it was against the backdrop of that USPSTF updated guideline that I and some colleagues from California conducted this analysis of the population-based data from the California Registry, looking at the population-based incidence rates of triple-negative breast cancer in Black women compared to white women at these different age categories. And what you see here is that the population-based incidence rates of triple-negative breast cancer for Black women in their 40s is even higher than the population-based incidence rates of triple-negative breast cancer for white American women in their 50s. And so if all women in the United States adhere to the updated USPSTF mammographic screening guidelines, we are likely to see a progressively worsening of the mortality gap in breast cancer that already exists. Now, the critics of screening mammograms are always quick to say that it's not clear that mammograms are effective in detecting triple-negative breast cancers at early stages. And so they often argue that screening mammography is not actually the answer to conquering triple-negative breast cancers and to conquering breast cancer disparities. Now, it is true that mammograms are not perfect, and they are somewhat more likely to miss triple-negative breast cancers compared to non-triple-negative breast cancers. but they are still effective at early detection of triple-negative breast cancer. And this is made clear from a study that came out of Memorial Sloan Kettering, where they looked specifically at nearly 200 cases of triple-negative breast cancers that were detected at a very small size, less than 1 centimeter in size, with negative lymph nodes, and most of these were detected by screening mammography. Look at the outcomes for these patients who had early detection of their triple-negative breast cancer. The 5-year local regional free survival, local regional recurrence-free survival, and distant recurrence-free survival is approximately 95% in all of these patients, regardless of whether or not they received adjuvant chemotherapy. So early detection is actually critical for triple-negative breast cancers. And so I, again, and many disparities researchers would argue that screening mammography is going to be that much more important for patients that are, for women that are at risk for triple-negative disease. Now, these data are from the annual report to the nation on the status of cancer, published in 2015 in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, demonstrating conclusively that on a national basis throughout the country, the population-based incidence rates of triple-negative breast cancer in African American women is significantly higher than the rates that we see in women of any other racial ethnic identity. And they are higher for women with African American identity at all different categories of age. The American Cancer Society has used information from the Surveillance, Epidemiology, and End Results Program, and also from the North American Association of Cancer Registrars, to document the fact that breast cancer incidence rates have actually been rising disproportionately in African Americans over the past few years, to the points where the incidence rates are actually equivalent now for breast cancer in African American compared to white American women. So between this issue of rising breast cancer incidence rates in African American women and the higher rates of triple-negative cancer in African American women, we are indeed seeing progressively worsening of the mortality gap. And now that mortality gap in terms of breast cancer death rates in the African American compared to white American community sits at a 42% difference. When I assumed my current position working with the Henry Ford Health System, one of the first things that we wanted to do in the research setting evaluating triple-negative breast cancer and disparities was to look at the issue of risk factors or precursors of triple-negative breast cancer for women with diverse backgrounds. And it is becoming increasingly clear that features of benign breast tissue that ultimately evolve into breast cancer are different in terms of the benign patterns that eventually turn into triple-negative breast cancer compared to benign patterns of fibrocystic changes that eventually transform into non-triple-negative breast cancer. So we put together this benign breast disease cohort from Henry Ford Health System consisting of more than 6,000 African American and white American women that had had a breast biopsy for some type of benign fibrocystic changes, and then we wanted to see what happened to those women in long-term follow-up. So in demonstrating that there was very powerful and pleasing equity of care delivered, we saw that the follow-up of these women was pretty much the same regardless of whether they were African American or white American. And overall, the frequency of patients that subsequently developed breast cancer was also comparable at just about 4% of these women, regardless of whether they were black or white, subsequently developing breast cancer. And the stage distribution of these cancers was also comparable, with just about a quarter of them ultimately being diagnosed with ductal carcinoma in situ, or a pre-invasive form of breast cancer. But look at what we see when we look specifically at the frequency of women that developed a triple-negative breast cancer compared to when you look at African American versus white American identity. About 25% of the women who were African American that developed breast cancer had a triple-negative tumor, compared to only 7% of the white American women who subsequently developed breast cancer having a triple-negative tumor. And again, these are all women who started out with the same basic risk factor for breast cancer that risk factor being that they had fibrocystic changes requiring breast biopsy at some time in the years prior. And these are the same data just demonstrated on an incidence curve basis, again showing the higher rates of triple-negative tumors in the African American compared to white American women who started out with fibrocystic changes. Now, many of the features that we use to characterize the breast cancer burden of African American women are the same features that characterize the breast cancer burden of women with known hereditary susceptibility for breast cancer. Those features being the younger age distribution, the higher frequency of hormone receptor negative and triple negative cancers, and the higher risk of male breast cancer. So this then begs the question of whether or not African ancestry in and of itself might be associated with some heritable markers that are associated with higher risk for triple negative disease. And so our group and many others strongly believe that by looking at the genetics of African ancestry and looking at the correlates of breast cancer in contemporary African populations, that these types of international studies will be very powerful opportunities for us to not only understand breast cancer disparities here in the United States better, but this is also a very unique opportunity to learn more about the pathogenesis of triple-negative breast cancer, to try to figure out what causes this aggressive pattern of disease. And so for the last about 14 years now, our group has been partnering with the Komfenochi Teaching Hospital in Kumasi, Ghana, which is located in western sub-Saharan Africa, to look at patterns of breast cancer in our various populations. These are the results of one of our updated comparisons. And you see that the Ghanaian women have the very youngest average age at breast cancer diagnosis. White Americans have the eldest average age at breast cancer diagnosis. African Americans have an intermediate average age at breast cancer diagnosis. Now, for Ghana, the age at diagnosis is, of course, also influenced by the fact that average longevity, life expectancy in Africa is lower because of the unfortunate lower medical resources altogether. But what we also found were these interesting differences in frequency of triple-negative breast cancer. More than half of the breast cancers in Ghanaian patients were triple-negative, lowest frequency at 16% in white American women, which is, and this is from the Henry Ford Hospital, but is pretty representative of what you see nationally, and intermediate frequency of triple-negative breast cancer in the African American patients. Same results when we worked with another hospital, the Korlebu Teaching Hospital located in Accra, Ghana. More than half of the cases were triple-negative. And these very high rates of triple-negative breast cancer in western sub-Saharan countries of Africa are much very different from what you see in the Americas and in Europe, where by and large fewer than 20% of the breast cancers that are diagnosed are triple-negative. Our epidemiology colleagues have been trying to sort out the reproductive and gynecologic risk factors for breast cancer, differentiating those features associated with triple-negative breast cancer compared to non-triple-negative breast cancer, and we see some interesting things. Specifically, there are differences with the way that multiple pregnancies impacts on breast cancer risk. For many, many decades now, we've always said that women who have multiple pregnancies are less likely to get breast cancer because all of the interruptions of the hormonal cycle over those multiple pregnancies reduces the hormonal exposure that the breast is seeing and tends to result in a protection against developing breast cancer. If you stratify, however, by triple-negative versus non-triple-negative breast cancer, what we see is that multiple pregnancies is really only protecting from getting a hormone receptor positive or a non-triple-negative breast cancer. And several investigators have actually shown that multiple pregnancies increases the risk of triple-negative breast cancer. So it's reasonable to then speculate perhaps it's the childbearing patterns of women in low and middle income countries that is accounting for these high frequencies of triple-negative tumors. But if you look at the frequency of triple-negative breast cancer in a variety of different low and middle income countries where you would expect the childbearing patterns to be similar, you don't see the same frequencies of triple-negative disease. These very high rates of triple-negative breast cancer are mostly identified in sub-Saharan African countries. And in Asia and Southeast Asia countries, North Africa, you tend to see lower frequencies of triple-negative breast cancer. So many of us believe that this is indeed somehow related to African ancestry as being associated with some genetic markers. And when you look at a variety of different breast cancer characteristics, average age at diagnosis, stepwise pattern with the youngest patients in Africa, eldest patients in white Americans and Europeans, intermediate for African Americans, frequency of male breast cancer tends to be highest in Africa, lowest in white Americans and Europeans, intermediate for African Americans. Same incremental patterns when you look at triple-negative tumors, high-grade tumors, and ER-negative tumors. So if there's something related to African ancestry, you would expect to see it expressed most strongly in Africa, expressed to an intermediate extent in African Americans because of the 4 centuries of genetic admixture that we've experienced. But Africa is still the founder population for all of mankind, so if there is some genetic marker, you will see it, in fact, in women around the world. We've also been looking at other markers of malignancy virulence. ALDH1 is a proposed marker of the mammary stem cell, and the stem cells drive the metastatic potential of cancers. We have found notably higher rates of ALDH1 expression in the Ghanaian breast cancer patients, again intermediate in the African Americans, compared to the ALDH1 expression in white Americans and Europeans. In trying to further research opportunities to investigate these differences, we've created essentially a library of patient-derived xenografts where we've taken fresh tumor specimens from triple-negative breast cancer patients that we operate on in Ghana and then implant these samples into immunocompromised mice at the University of Michigan, because this then gives us a renewable supply of these tumors that we can use for evaluating the tumor biology, and very, very excitingly, we will hopefully be able to use these xenografts to look at effectiveness of novel therapies for breast cancer. Now, it is becoming a very powerful research tool to look at triple-negative breast cancer subtypes. Triple-negative breast cancers, the tumors that are negative for ER, PR, and HER2, it's not just one disease. There's actually a whole diverse pattern of triple-negative tumors. Most of these triple-negative subtypes were defined by publicly available gene expression profile data sets. Vast majority of those data sets coming from white Americans, Europeans, Asian women, no populations of note with significant degrees of African ancestry. And these triple-negative subtypes do indeed have clinical relevance, because at least one of these triple-negative subtypes, the luminal androgen receptor subtype, tends to be more resistant than the others to neoadjuvant chemotherapy, and we might be able to manipulate it effectively with anti-androgen therapies such as bicalutamide. We don't, however, know if the triple-negative breast cancers that we see so much more commonly in women with African ancestry represent the same patterns of triple-negative breast cancer that we see in European and white American women. And this is just another example of some of the triple-negative subtyping that has been done, but again based upon largely white American patients. So in looking at one way to develop a surrogate or a substitute, easier way to identify the triple-negative subtypes, I and my colleagues looking at our Ghanaian breast cancer patient population simply applied immunohistochemistry to evaluate ALDH1 as well as androgen receptor, and we did see an interesting subset of these triple-negative tumors that had co-expression of both of these markers, which you wouldn't necessarily expect given the existing data on triple-negative subtypes. So this is really just hypothesis-generating work, true triple-negative breast cancer subtyping requires special sophisticated technologies involving extraction of RNA from tumors and then gene expression profiling. The Cancer Genome Atlas is also demonstrating that there is unique diversity in the cancers of African American patients, and these studies are suggesting that African American women do indeed have different patterns of triple-negative tumors. So this issue of evaluating the genetics of breast cancer related to African American ancestry is gaining traction, as summarized by several of these recent studies that have been published. And last summer, the NIH issued a press release that they are launching the largest scale ever study of breast cancer genetics in African American women with this $12 million grant that was awarded to the Vanderbilt investigators to look further at the genetics of breast cancer in African Americans. However, I would propose that the international studies are still going to be very important as we try to tease out the genetics of African ancestry from tumor biology in breast cancer patients, because if you look at African American women with breast cancer, you will always end up having your results at least somewhat clouded by racial ethnic identity as a socio-political construct. You'll be looking at the African ancestry experience in the context of living in the Americas. So I would say that looking at international populations and looking at breast cancer in African women will also remain important as we try to figure out these differences with the genetics of breast cancer. And these international studies are just very, very exciting and gratifying from the perspectives of being able to invest in woefully underserved populations. So when I talk about how underserved these hospitals and facilities are, I want to just show you some photo examples. Obviously, none of these photographs of hospital facilities would be anything like what you would see in a typical American hospital. In the preoperative area at the Komfenochi Teaching Hospital, if you have the medical records at all, they're just housed in cardboard boxes. The patients don't have sheets on the stretchers, and this is what we use as our sterile scrub sink. But my colleagues there, they do the very best they can with the limited resources available to them. The conduct of this international research, however, again, very gratifyingly, has resulted in an investment in the resources that are available for treating the breast cancer patients. For example, we've been able to support the development of a multidisciplinary breast cancer program, and we conduct regular communications on a weekly basis with our collaborators in Ghana through teleconferencing and discussing of cases in our tumor boards. A highlight of every visit to Ghana is a visit to the pediatrics ward where they actually have their own classroom, and it's just a lot of fun to be able to donate educational supplies and toys for the kids there. The program has actually ended up developing a dedicated multidisciplinary clinical pathology team focused on breast cancer at the Komfenochi Teaching Hospital. And very importantly, we've been able to establish not only a core needle biopsy program so that they can diagnose their cancers much more efficiently, but they are now also able to do immunohistochemistry to evaluate their own ER, PR, and HER2/neu expression on the patients at the hospital in real time. Prior to the development of this program, which grew out of our training exchange programs, they really didn't know whether they were treating a triple-negative breast cancer or not. And so some patients would get endocrine therapy, even though their cancer may have been negative for ER and PR. Some patients might have been getting chemotherapy when perhaps they had a tumor that would have been amenable to tamoxifen or aromatase inhibitors. We've expanded our program to now look at the breast cancer burden of East Africa as represented by patients at the St. Paul's Millennium Hospital in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and we're very excited about launching the same immunohistochemistry program at that hospital within this year. So I'm going to finish up in the next few minutes now, but in looking at the comparison of breast cancers in East Africa versus West Africa compared to African Americans and white Americans, we really weren't sure what we would find because there were limited, very, very limited, sparse data on the frequency of triple-negative breast cancer in Ethiopian breast cancer patients. And in this first study that we've published, we see, again, that the African patients, both from Ghana and Ethiopia, are very, very young at time of diagnosis. All of the population subsets with African ancestry, African American, Ghanaian, and Ethiopian, tend to have high-grade tumors, more so than what you see in white American patients. And look at what we found with the frequency of triple-negative breast cancers. Again, the frequency of triple-negative tumors was highest in the Ghanaian women, intermediate for African American. The frequency of triple-negative tumors was similarly low for the white American patients and for the Ethiopian patients at just about 15%. And when we controlled for patients younger than the age of 50, these same patterns persisted. Highest rates in the Ghanaians, intermediate for African Americans, similarly low triple-negative frequencies for white Americans and Ethiopians. So we think that this is actually explained by the patterns of the African diaspora and patterns of forced population migration through the slave trade several centuries ago. The transatlantic slave trade largely brought Africans from the western sub-Saharan region, including Ghana, over to the Americas. But the slave trade from East Africa, including Ethiopia, was largely controlled by Arabic traders and brought those populations further eastward to the Mideast and to Asian countries. And so it's very likely that African Americans have more similar patterns of breast cancer to Ghanaians compared to Ethiopians, simply because we have more shared ancestry with Western Africa compared to East Africa. So to summarize, we know that breast cancer is a very heterogeneous, diverse disease. Breast cancer subtypes vary in terms of their treatment needs and their prognosis. They vary in terms of genetic predisposition, and these different breast cancer subtypes will vary in prevalence within population subsets. So eliminating breast cancer and achieving the Komen promise to decrease breast cancer mortality rate by 50% in the next 10 years is going to be dependent on our ability to better characterize the diversity of this disease in diverse populations worldwide. So this was the basis for forming the International Center for the Study of Breast Cancer Subtypes at my home institution, the Henry Ford Health System, where our mission statement is to reduce the global breast cancer burden through advances in research and delivery of care to diverse populations worldwide. And I'm very, very happy to be able to utilize funds from the Komen Scholars Leadership Grant to perform triple-negative breast cancer subtyping in the internationally diverse patient populations that are contributing to our work. And we are calling this global body of research oncologic anthropology, where we look at breast cancer disparities related to racial ethnic identity from the behavioral science and social sciences, but also from the genetic context as well. And if anybody at the meeting is interested in contributing to this research, we are actually recruiting patients at one of the tables in the main conference room. It's a very simple procedure to contribute to this research, but it does require signing a consent form so that we can obtain medical records from the treating facility and hopefully a tissue specimen if any leftover tissue blocks are available, and collecting a saliva specimen because we also hope to do genotyping analyses to compare the germline genetics, the genetics that we're born with, to the genetics of the tumors. Ultimately, we will be looking at a whole host of different features in this international registry, and I won't get into the details there, but we're very, very excited about the global growth of this program, and this slide simply summarizes the various countries where we are either actively recruiting now or where we have research partnerships in development. And I want to thank, of course, the many, many different wonderful partners and patients from all around the world that have supported this work. And whenever I talk about breast cancer disparities, I always close by quoting these three survival rates of 60%, 43%, and 20%. These survival rates have nothing to do with breast cancer. These are the survival rates for the first class, the second class, and the third class passengers of the Titanic. And even though my research focuses on looking at the biology of breast cancer in diverse populations related to genetics, I always have to underscore this most important fact, which is that outcome and the likelihood of surviving any threat to health is always going to be dependent on access to care. Just like the third-class passengers of the Titanic did not have access to the lifeboats, it is unfortunately, tragically true that our racial ethnic minorities and socioeconomically disadvantaged people do not have access to optimal cancer care. And my favorite quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of all the forms of injustice, inequality in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. Okay. So I thank everybody for their time and attention. Oh, and I finished up before I got the 5-minute mark. All right.
So we had some assistants who passed around papers. So if you had questions, they want to collect those questions, and if you can just hold them up in the air so that they may obtain them and bring them here. And again, we want to thank Dr. Newman for coming here. Her body is 3 hours ahead of our time right now. And next week she's traveling to India.
Yep.
India to do work. So she is always on the go, and we are just so humbled and thankful that you took the time to come over here to the West Side.
Yeah, I am just so honored that you guys invited me.
Yes,
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
yes. So please pass those up to me so we can get some questions answered. So this question says, can we start screening African American women at younger age, and will insurance pay? That's the first part.
So obviously, there's a lot of flux and uncertainty regarding what the future holds for insurance coverage. But at the moment, with the Affordable Care Act and with the guidelines that are endorsed by not only the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, but the other organizations such as American Cancer Society, Komen, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, all of these bodies say that mammograms should, at a minimum, be available to women starting at age 40, even though these organizations have different recommendations at the age at which they they become essential. So the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force says that mammograms have to be initiated by age 50. The American Cancer Society says it's imperative that they begin by age 45. But they all endorse availability of mammograms starting at age 40. So right now, coverage is still available for women starting at age 40. Because overall those incidence rates are, even though they're higher for African American women younger than age 40 compared to white American women, they are still sufficiently low that it would be difficult to say that mammograms should be routinely offered to African American women younger than age 40. But we do need better ways to image the breast, and it would be wonderful if we had more effective ways of screening the breast compared to mammograms for our younger women. Again, we'll see what the future holds, but right now, women will have access to mammograms starting at age 40. And I do also want to emphasize the importance of knowing your family history. Women that have a strong family history and any evidence of hereditary predisposition for breast cancer may well need to get their mammograms younger than age 40, and they may need supplemental breast imaging such as magnetic resonance imaging, molecular breast imaging, 3D mammography. These are all other additional very exciting ways to image the breasts of women at high risk and women with dense breasts.
In America, are genetic ethnic markers being used to determine country or countries or regions of ancestry to correlate or compare to those individuals in Africa?
They should be. We haven't gotten to the point where utilizing ancestry informative markers, which are the genetic markers that can actually quantify ancestral background, those markers aren't used routinely in research. I think that we will be going there for a number of reasons. Number one, the technology to obtain that information is becoming much, much cheaper, so it'll be easier to utilize those technologies in the research setting in the future. And I think we're going to have to. Racial ethnic identity as a socio-political construct is still important because we do need to understand social factors that define our patients and that predict for outcome from different problems. But in trying to figure out the genetics of different cancers, being able to quantify ancestral background by these markers, such as ancestry informative markers, will be very, very important. And we are becoming an increasingly admixed population in the United States and elsewhere. So looking at these markers in a more scientific way really does make a lot more sense.
Have you tested for BRCA1 and 2 in Ethiopia or elsewhere? And then are you noticing a similar pattern to Jewish women? Yes, okay.
Both very, very great questions. In the United States, there has been, fortunately, a big push in recent years to make more African American families aware of the importance of genetic counseling and genetic testing when there looks like there's some inherited susceptibility. And so we are identifying more markers in mutations in BRCA1 and BRCA2 in African American families that seem to be associated with breast cancer, but we're not able to evaluate them very cleanly because we're seeing them without having a lot of information to go on. So we see more of these variants of uncertain significance in African American families in those BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. In Africa, very little is known about inherited susceptibility for breast cancer through BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. In the studies that have been done, there's some data in Nigerian women, and there are some data in South Africa. There have been some founder mutations identified, and the link between BRCA mutation carrier status and triple-negative breast cancers has been confirmed. In a very recent study that I did with some PhD students in Ghana, it will be published, at least I'm probably not supposed to talk about studies that aren't published yet, but in some preliminary work that we've conducted that will be published, we do actually see the fascinatingly high rates of BRCA mutations, the ones that are seen in Ashkenazi Jewish populations in Ghanaian women with triple-negative breast cancer.
Do immunotherapy treatments have similar outcome results in African Americans?
Wow, that's also a great question. So you guys heard a fabulous, very eloquent lecture from Dr. Page this morning talking about immunotherapy for breast cancer. And immunotherapy, as he described, it can be applied in a lot of different ways. Most of the strategies that he discussed this morning have not been evaluated extensively in diverse populations, but there is a subtype of research related to immunotherapy that does have some pretty provocative patterns in African Americans. And this is in the area of looking at what we call tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, where we look at tumors that have a high volume of an inflammatory cellular component of those tumors. And this pattern of tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes happens to be particularly important in triple-negative breast cancers. And we do see higher rates of these tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes in some of the existing data regarding African-American breast cancer patients. But a lot more work needs to be done looking at those patterns.
What gene is lacking in triple negative, and is there any way to boost the gene?
Oh, I wish I had the definitive answer to that question. We do know that triple negative breast cancers are quite common and they account for the majority of women that have BRCA1 mutations. And conversely, we know that triple negative breast cancer in and of itself is a red flag that a woman might carry a BRCA1 mutation regardless of her family history. But beyond that, we can't say that we know of a particular marker that causes triple negative breast cancer. We just know that there is this association between BRCA1 mutation carrier status and triple negative tumors.
And there was a second part, I'm not exactly sure, but the second part of the question was, why won't insurance pay for BRCA screening? So, yeah.
Well, since the Supreme Court ruling, genetic testing for hereditary susceptibility to cancers is more widely available, and there are a lot more, there's much more information that we can be gleaned from that testing with panel testing now, but it is still costly, and so the insurance policies agreeing to cover it and the extent to which they will cover it is just quite variable. We don't have good uniformity in those policies now.
I might add, if you're diagnosed with it twice, they'll pay for it.
Very good point. There are very specific categories of women that are much more likely to have it covered. Bilateral breast cancer is definitely one of them, male breast cancer in the family being another. Thank you for that comment. Oh, yeah.
With that, there's certain indicators for genetic testing. African American ancestry in and of itself is not an indication for an increased chance of
Correct.
BRCA1 mutation. Triple negative breast cancer is. So if someone has had that under the age of 60, that's an indicator.
Yeah.
There's right next to her desk, if you're stopping by for the sample, there's a sheet there that says, who should be referred for genetic counseling indicators if you have a history or family history. It's a good place to start, seeing if there are maybe indicators that warrant a risk assessment, talking about the testing that's available. Negative B1.
Thank you.
And on this subject, the cost of BRCA testing is as low as like $279 from Color Genomics. So you don't need to go through the very expensive testing. You can call them up, get on their website, and just go for it. Although
Yeah, it is
for some
definitely
populations,
improved.
It's still
Yeah.
a significant
Yeah.
279, but it's not like the 5,000
Right.
that it was before 2013.
Yeah, very true. Definitely improved. And as more women get tested, especially more diverse women, we will understand a lot of these mutations much better.
Okay. Couple more questions. What is the role of BRCA-related breast cancer triple negative in sub-Sahara Africa and Africa America?
Hard to say because of the extremely low volume of data available in African women. So unfortunately, I just can't give a meaningful answer to that question, although hopefully with the work that we're doing internationally, we will have at least some preliminary answers to that question within the next few years.
This may be out, but we'll still have. Do you know of any studies that look at the rate of BRCA in women who have used infertility treatments?
Oh, well, I can't comment on BRCA testing in women that have gone for fertility treatments, but there is a very common question. Oh, maybe BRCA meant breast cancer.
Is that what that's supposed to?
Yeah.
The rate of breast cancer, maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe.
So that's been questioned quite a bit over the years, and some people continue to question it. But in a really nice meta-analysis of the data that was presented at the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium, I think a year and a half ago, they did not show any association between breast cancer risk and fertility treatments.
But since we're on the subject of hormone, have you seen any connection with maybe like hormone replacement therapy and breast cancer, say for like
Well, it definitely sustained hormone replacement therapy in postmenopausal women for more than 3.5 years increases the risk of breast cancer in both African American and white American women. And the Women's Health Initiative long-term follow-up looking at women that did get breast cancer when they received hormone replacement therapy, that study also showed an approximately 3 to 4-fold higher risk of ER-negative cancers in the African American women compared to the white American women. Now, in terms of thyroid problems, there has been over past many decades links identified between thyroid conditions and developing breast cancer, but it was never really clear whether or not there was any type of a true causal association or whether we were just looking at two conditions that both happen to be very common in women. So for the Gale model that predicts individual risk of breast cancer, that thyroid issues actually, when the model was being developed, thyroid issues actually came very close to being included in that model just because of the statistical association, but it never reached strong enough association.
So, we ended a little bit early, but just wanted to remind you, Dr. Newman does have a table set up in the main ballroom where you can contribute to her studies, okay? All you have to do is sign a consent form, and please make a contribution. I'm pretty sure some of you have come with other women, and everybody go make contributions because we need this information. It's very important. Also, Sisters Network. We are a new affiliate chapter here in the area. We are always open to have supporters. You don't have to be African American because we're all in this working together, right? We meet every second Saturday at the Junekey Delta Center in North. I'm a Southern girl. I'm still learning. Northeast Portland, but is that right? North Portland. Okay, thank you. We have a table also at the exhibits area, so if you can also visit that, as we will have a 10-city tour coming here in Portland in July. And then we also have our open house coming up in the month of May. So if you could go visit our table, we have more information on that where Susan G. Komen and us, we will be working, partnering together. So, all right. Thank you so much.